I think so much of what's happening right now in corporate America, and in particular with like Silicon Valley, big tech, and AI, what we're seeing is a kind of enclosure of data and information. But I think there are still market opportunities, but ways to keep data open and free and accessible and transparent. I think there's just so many sort of untapped creative applications of technology that could make it so that it could be used for justice. And I think, yes, we are entering a kind of new or different era of transparency in which these citizen data science groups are wielding data as a tool for accountability and transparency. And they're often highly creative. I'm Catherine D'Ignazio. I'm an associate professor of urban science and planning at MIT. I also run a lab there called the Data Plus Feminism Lab, where broadly speaking, what we do is we try to use data and computation to address gender and racial justice.
What does it look like to take a feminist approach to data science?
So a feminist approach to data science is necessary for the ways in which we need to look at how power influences the production of information at every stage of the process, from what information we even have to how we analyze information to what are our outputs and who do they serve from a data science process. And so a feminist approach, according to myself and Lauren Klein, who were the co-authors of a book called Data Feminism, we developed 7 principles to try to say, well, what would it look like to make data science more feminist? And by which we mean to make data science work in the service of gender equality, but also in the service of racial equality, in the service of income inequality, and addressing social inequality, just sort of more broadly speaking. If we take that as one of our central things that we want data science to do, to really do good in the world, to rectify some of these imbalances of power, what do we need to do to sort of get there? And what do we need to change about our more conventional sort of data science practices? And so we have 7 principles. And they're things like examine power. So really just try to look at, again, across the pipeline, kind of where does power and inequality come in? Challenge power. Embrace pluralism, so bring more voices to the table in any kind of analysis process, also in the process of communicating data, make labor visible, rethink binaries and hierarchies. So basically there's these 7 things. And in the book, we sort of go over what do these mean and how would one actually do this in practice. So we're very much concerned about sort of how do we introduce feminism to data scientists, and also how do we introduce data science to feminists, and how do we kind of bring these 2 communities together and really start a productive dialogue around a more just data science.
So data science is predominantly male. Is that correct?
Yes. And so, that would be absolutely true. And in fact, as the sort of enterprise of data science has become more and more prestigious, as we've seen the rise of big data, predictive analytics, now all we're talking about is AI, of course, the more kind of prestigious these technical fields become, the less and less gender equality there is. So the more and more women and gender minorities sort of get pushed out of these fields and men sort of stay at the top. And so that is one thing that we talk about is sort of the narrowness of the demographics of the folks who are actually doing this work, designing these technologies, undertaking these kinds of analysis. And that certainly is a key sort of part of the equation for like bringing more people to the table for who's actually doing the work in the first place.
What would you say are some of your favorite moments once the book came out in 2020? I'm sure you had a lot of conversations with data scientists, people in big tech.
Yeah.
What are some of your favorite moments?
Sure. Well, the book went much further than we thought. Lauren and I at the time thought we were writing kind of this niche book. We thought, we're mostly going to be speaking to people who already care about gender studies. And the surprising thing was that there was a real hunger for this approach. And some of what we said really resonated with people. And I would say with people that I was surprised by. So this would be like math and statistics teachers, for example, policymakers. I would say we're very well embraced by the computer science community and the data science community for the most part, the arts and humanities folks as well. And so I think what we saw was like, for some folks, it was really about how do I bring the values I already have into working with data? Because I haven't seen how to do that yet. And then for other folks, it was like, maybe I am a professional data scientist, but I've had a little bit of qualms in terms of the ways that we're working with data or how decontextualized my numbers are, or I've had doubts about like, are these numbers even comprehensive? How were they collected? I don't know because nobody gave me the metadata. And so for those folks, it was a kind of giving them a language to name some of these doubts that they had and then to kind of work on them and further their own practices.
And what did you learn when you started thinking about questions like, can technology be used for good?
I do think technology can be used for good. And in fact, my whole sort of career is premised on this idea that we can use technology for good. But I think, again, we have to come back to thinking very intentionally about what is good, right? And good for whom. And part of that for me is recognizing some of the current power imbalances in technology, which start with sort of the who's at the table, the sort of gender, and I would say also racial issues of like who's even in these, server rooms, like creating these technologies in the first place. But also all of the groups that could potentially have technologies designed for them, but there isn't necessarily like a market there that's going to make a big corporation go into that space. I think there's just so many sort of untapped creative applications of technology that could make it so that it could be used for justice.
And so with that, you've started working with communities, activists, journalists.
Yeah.
To leverage technology and databases. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So at the Data Plus Feminism Lab, I would say we're very much interested in kind of this critique of kind of the existing configuration of resources around AI, data science, and computation. But at the same time, we're very interested in modeling ways to do it differently. So that's to say that we're not just in the business of like throwing stones from outside and being like, this is bad, and this is bad. But more in the sense of we want to actually get down and actually model, like, how would we do data science in a feminist way? What problems arise in the process? And so this is exemplified, I think, by a recent project that we've been working on with activists who monitor human rights violations, and predominantly in Latin America. So these are activists who are working on the topic of feminicide, which is gender-based violence that is fatal against women and girls. And these activists, what they do is they're carefully tabulating from news articles. They're trying to discover and document cases of feminicide and create databases. So they're in the business of data production, basically.
Because it's not currently tracked?
Correct. And so this is the key thing, is that the state, the governments in basically all countries, fail to actually tabulate, keep count of these particular cases. And this is actually true even in countries where there are laws about femicide and feminicide.
Okay.
So even when there's a law in the books that says, this is a crime or this is a kind of aggravation of the crime of homicide, there's not actually a systematic, comprehensive, accurate count, and certainly not one that is then like released out into the public. Mm-hmm. And so the activists have sort of stepped into this issue and said, well, we will count because our institutions are basically failing us right now. This is not an isolated case of like kind of one person doing this in one place. In fact, we have now cataloged over 200 different projects around the world who are doing exactly this process of like reading news articles and trying to log cases of feminicide. So it's an incredibly widespread practice of what you might call citizen data science or data activism, but basically folks who are trying to keep these counts and then use those counts for advocacy, for policy change, for raising public awareness, for reframing the problem of feminicide in their countries. And so this was a space where, as we began to be in dialogue with the activists, and in some cases journalists, we thought, well, we have something we can bring to the table in terms of technology. So many of the ways that they're going about monitoring and capturing these cases are very manual. So they're literally like loading websites, they're checking individual web pages of news organizations. And so we said, actually, we can automate some part of this work. And so we developed an AI, basically a machine learning classifier that automatically is out sort of scouting on the internet for their particular country, looking for news stories that are describing a case of feminicide. It runs those through a machine learning classifier, and those that kind of meet the criteria, which the criteria actually has been defined by activists, then they get passed off to the activists themselves for consideration.
Are you able to scale that? Can a tool that is trained in Spanish read media in other countries in other languages?
So that's a great question. We're working on this. No. And so the interesting thing about this, so we've trained a model for each language. So we have English, Spanish, and Portuguese. We're currently working on a collaboration with an organization in Kenya in Swahili. And so we have to train a new model in each case. But the other reason we have to train a new model is not only language, but there's actually significant contextual differences and different definitions in some cases of feminicide. And this has been very interesting as a kind of computational issue because this is something where, even an activist in let's say two activists in Peru working from two different groups, they might not even agree with each other on what constitutes a feminicide.
Can you give us a little bit more context? How so?
So one kind of debate right now in the feminicide community is a debate around induced suicide. When a woman commits suicide, but it's because she's been driven to that point by abuse from usually an intimate partner. And so there are feminist groups who they would call this a feminicide. There is, I think, one country, El Salvador, which actually defines that legally, so that they actually have induced suicide as a kind of a legal definition, and that would count in that country as a feminicide. But in other places, people would disagree with that. So there are these gray areas over what constitutes a feminicide and what does not constitute a feminicide. And so this was some of the complexity, I would say, that we had to think about and navigate as we were designing a machine learning classifier to try to say that this news article does or does not describe a case of feminicide. And so what we did in these cases was we typically err on the side of showing the activists more information. And then we also leave it ultimately up to the activists or journalists to decide whether to include that case. So we present them with here's what the machine learning classifier thought, here's what the system thought. Do you agree? And it's only once they agree, according to their definition of feminicide and their context, that case gets included into their database. And so this was a way to I would say value the labor and also the real grounded political knowledge of the activists themselves, and also a way to make the AI kind of more context sensitive, let's say, especially when there is no one global definition of feminicide. So we often think about our technologies, part of the benefit of technology is scaling, standardization, but this is a case in which it doesn't make sense to standardize because actually the reality is sort of fragmented. There's a lot of variation. And so this was a way we could design it so that it would support variation and support context and center the knowledge of the activists and journalists themselves, if that makes sense.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the impact you've been seeing so far now that you're able to count this data?
The impact from counting feminicide is really the groups themselves. So we think about the role of the Data Plus Feminism Lab and then the project that this is a part of as a kind of public interest technology project that's in service of the activists assembling their databases. So we don't assemble data. We make technologies that help them assemble their databases. And then what they do with that information, I find to be incredibly sort of inspiring and creative. And so on the one hand, they are often in dialogue with government agencies. They're writing reports. They're pushing for policy changes and sort of reparations for families who've been impacted, and in particular for children who've been impacted. But they also use their data in highly creative ways to create, for example, physical data visualizations. So they'll take their data over the course of, let's say, a year, and they'll stage these large interventions in public spaces. And often they're symbolic public spaces. So they're like the Central Plaza in front of the Congress, or there's one group that did a large public intervention outside the court for their state in Argentina. And they create these installations that are, we say, very haunting. And often this is through the use of shoes with no people in them, or chairs that are empty. And so each chair, for example, represents a person who's not with us. And then you see, through the just really literally like the scope and scale of the space that sort of would have been occupied by these bodies, you can see, and I think like sort of appreciate the human toll of kind of what we have lost. So it's a way of, I would say, staging a kind of public dialogue about like, here's where we are and like, where do we go from here? Yeah.
Why wouldn't feminicide cases be counted?
One of the things that's going on right now is we're told over and over again that we live in this data saturated world, that, there's all these sort of narratives like the government knows everything, Facebook knows everything, Google knows everything about you. And it sort of promotes this false narrative that we actually have information about everything that's important in the world. And in fact, that's not the case. And we talk a lot about this concept in data feminism of missing data. These are data that do not exist because an institution has not collected them. And so there's a kind of a political demand by framing something as missing data. You're sort of saying these data should exist, but they don't. And there's a way of like then responsibilizing who is the entity that should be collecting those data. So for example, in the case of feminicide, what many of the sort of social movements, as well as kind of journalists and public reporting have done, is to say, look, we're collecting this data about feminicide, but they often point the finger at governments and say, you should be doing this work. And many activists, actually, when we interviewed them, they told us, we don't want to do this work. Like, this is terrible work. We're never going to be able to do it in the same way or at the same scale as like the state. But we do this work because the state is not fulfilling one of its like most basic obligations to the people right now, which is to protect them and keep them safe. Feminicide is a powerful example of missing data. But there are many other examples of missing data, things that one thinks we should have information about, but in fact we don't. So for example, in the case of the United States, we have this huge problem with housing, right? Housing insecurity, housing instability, housing affordability, evictions, certainly post-COVID. And one of the things that my team and I have discovered very intimately is that if you want to work on evictions, in fact, there is no national or federal database of evictions. The data are collected piecemeal by housing courts or county courts. They are not shared. It's often very difficult even to obtain data for one housing court in one jurisdiction, for example, like Boston, let alone if you want to try to get a national picture of evictions. And so I would frame evictions as a case of missing data in the context of the United States. It's a sort of really pressing social and political issue. We kind of need insight as a way of then even just having any kind of meaningful policy. Are they going up and down or down? Just even asking like those very basic kind of data-driven questions. But we can't ask those questions because we don't have that information. So
you and I had talked about some of the implications for private sector. Can you talk a little bit about that?
There's interesting ways in which we can start to get a hold of these data, which then can potentially expose private sector to some risks. Because one of the things that's happening in the eviction space and in the sort of housing instability space right now is there's been a kind of a aggregation, let's say, of housing properties. So they've become actually part of the portfolio of venture capitalists, of hedge funds and things like this. So folks are seeing housing as a way to turn a quick profit. There's a whole industry of prop tech, property technology that has arisen to kind of help facilitate those things. So like, smart lock systems, surveillance cameras that are networked so that landlords can manage properties and so on. And at the same time, some of the most recent research shows that the corporate landlords are actually some of also the worst evictors. And so there would be some potentially risk maybe in having a national evictions database because what it would permit a kind of visibility into like who of these actors is kind of the most egregious evictor, right? Like who is doing serial eviction without regard, let's say, to property rights, or maybe they're using it as a tool to just get people out so they can raise the rent, and so on and so forth. And so there's a kind of interesting transparency kind of function that such a database would serve that would hopefully make corporate landlords a little bit nervous, actually.
So if AI is enabling, whether it's people like you with labs or journalists or community activists to address missing data, does this mean we're in a new era of transparency that business may not be aware of?
I think it's something to take into account, because increasingly, and this is a lot of what my work looks at, is these citizen data practices. And what's happening is that as, sort of data have become democratized, we have relatively like sort of free open tools like Google Spreadsheets, let's say, right? Where it becomes sort of cheaper and cheaper, easier and easier. You don't need that much data literacy to compile a spreadsheet and make some visualizations. We see these being picked up by these groups. So like, yes, activists and social movements, journalists, academic researchers, community-based organizations, and advocacy organizations. And I think, yes, we are entering a kind of new or different era of transparency in which these citizen data science groups are wielding data as a tool for accountability and transparency. And they're often highly creative. And I think actually the journalists in this regard are extra creative because they're quite sophisticated at understanding a particular milieu, let's say, like a particular information environment, and then saying, well, who would be the entities that would have this information? How can I obtain that information and then cross-reference it with other data to tell a compelling sort of accountability story?
I don't think we covered counter data. Do you want to get into that?
Sure.
Yeah.
And so counter data is like a counterpoint to missing data. So missing data, again, is the data that don't exist because our institutions do not collect those data. And like the feminicide data activists, they decided to just go forward and they would collect the data. And so this is an example of counter data. So these are data that are produced from sort of outside of our, what we might call our counting institutions. So outside of government, typically, outside of other organizations that are well-resourced that typically produce data sets. And so often counter data are specifically about either filling in gaps. So in the case of missing data, they're literally about filling in the gap. Like we have no information, so we're just going to go ahead and collect what we can. Or in some cases, counter data are about challenging official information. And so this actually also happens in the case of feminicide. So there are, for example, in Mexico, the federal government does release numbers about feminicide. They release aggregate counts. They don't release anything more sort of detailed. But the interesting thing about this is that the counter data that are produced by the activist and journalist community are regularly double the statistics that the Mexican government gives. So it's a political strategy from civil society to challenge the official numbers and produce a kind of then public discourse about, well, why, what are the measurement strategies here? What's different about this? How are we counting differently in these different cases? Yeah.
As you look to, all of these tools to address the missing data, counter data, what takeaways would you have for business leaders?
I think so much of what's happening right now in corporate America, and in particular with like Silicon Valley, big tech, and AI, what we're seeing is a kind of enclosure of data and information. But I think there are still market opportunities, but ways to keep data open and free and accessible and transparent, and ways to actually leverage citizen participation in data practices. So how do we get back to some of these earlier ideals around connectedness, transparency, sharing, rather than locking down?
So besides open data, what else should CEOs be thinking about?
So I think the other thing is thinking through which parts of a kind of the information ecosystem should be privatizable or should be sort of proprietary and able to be enclosed. What is the balance of enclosure versus commons that we think promotes a healthy technological future for everybody? And I would say we are just not investing in that commons right now. And if we think like of the analogy of roads, right? There is no company that owns all the roads. And it would be silly to think that, because what happens is everyone builds on top of the roads. We put buildings on roads. We put houses on roads. That's the infrastructure that allows us to do everything else. And so that's sort of the question that I would posit is, how do we infrastructure the infrastructure, right? How do we build a collective and healthy public digital infrastructure such that everyone can build on top of it and not just, 5 corporations or something like that?